Hello there, and welcome to the last session in this three-part series that's exploring the nature of faith as a type of embrace of contradiction. In each of the sessions, I'm taking a different thinker to look at the theme. So in the first session, we took C.S. Lewis to explore the notion of a truth that transcends the binary of knowing and unknowing, a type of truth that manifests itself whenever we enter into unknowing and find a type of knowledge embedded within it. In the second session, we looked at the theme of joy, a joy that transcends the categories of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Joy is a type of affirmation of life and of meaning and of depth that we discover when we really delve into dissatisfaction and find something satisfying within it. And so today, what I want to look at is the notion of a type of devotion that transcends the categories of theism and atheism. A type of devotion or religious life that somehow delves into the darkest heart of atheism and finds an affirmation of theism within it. So to start with, I want to look at the mystics, because the mystics were the first group to really understand how theism and atheism work together. Often we think of these as two opposing camps that either fight each other or have to tolerate each other. But for some of the mystics, they began to see how atheism and theism not only dance together, not only critique each other, but also enrich each other, challenge each other, and make each other richer in the process. So we take someone like Meister Eckhart, one of the greatest of the mystics, who once prayed, "God, rid me of God." Now what he means there is that every time you say the word God, every time you try to name what ultimate reality is, that naming doesn't grasp what you're trying to say. And so at the same time, the person of devotion is the one who also denames God. So every theism, it corresponds to an atheism. Every claim must also undermine itself. Every theological statement is under erasure. This can be called a type of theopoetics, or what the philosopher Jean-Luc Marion calls denomination. So you nominate, which means you name, and then you denominate, which means you dename. So in the Lord's Prayer, for example, you have the opening lines, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." So in the first line, you have the name Father. But in the second line, you have the idea that this name is hallowed, meaning holy, meaning other than we can imagine. So it is named as Father and then denamed, saying not like you understand that word. There is something that is not being grasped in that very language. This is a type of theopoetics. Now, Anselm was probably the mystic or the philosopher who gave the most systematic reason for this. He argued that there's three levels to reality, three ways something can exist. Something can exist only in the mind and not in reality. Something can exist in the mind and in reality. Or something can exist in reality and not in the mind. So if I'm going to paint something, at first it's just in my mind, it's not in reality. And that's the lowest level of existence. You can't touch it or taste it or see it. It's just a mental image in my brain. But then I paint the painting. And now the painting exists in reality and it exists in the mind. Other people can look at the painting, other people can conceptualize it. And those two levels of being basically cover everything. Things exist either only in the mind like unicorns or exist in the mind and in reality like horses. But then Anselm said that if God exists, God must exist at the highest level. And the highest level is something that exists in reality but that cannot be contained in the mind. And so this idea led the mystics to always embrace a type of theism as in a way deeper than theism. That denying your conceptions of ultimate reality is part of how you try to approach ultimate reality. You're standing in something that you cannot quite grasp. But I want to look primarily now at the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who also explores this relationship between atheism and theism in a slightly different way. I want to look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer's last works, his thinking while he was imprisoned shortly before he was executed by the Nazis. In this work, The Letters and Papers from Prison, Bonhoeffer starts to think about a notion that he calls religionless Christianity. And he says in that work that one must live as though God does not exist. And that as you live as though God does not exist, you live fully before God and with God. So Bonhoeffer is saying here that we have to fully embrace a type of atheism. And it's in that embrace of atheism that we somehow affirm theism. Now, to understand what he means, you've got to realize that Bonhoeffer is critiquing a certain notion of God that has been popular right through Christianity up until the present age. And he's critiquing it not in the sense of saying that it's always wrong, but saying that this notion of God is now becoming redundant. It's now losing its power. And he calls this notion of God the Deus ex machina. Now, a Deus ex machina is a term from Greek theatre in which some playwright would be writing their play and they'd maybe kill off a character for dramatic effect. And then later on, they would want to bring the character back. And so what they would do is they would have a god or some angel or whatever descend from the theatre roof, do the magical act of bringing the character back to life or whatever other miraculous act needs to happen, and then would be wheeled off again. And Bonhoeffer said that God was a type of Deus ex machina that we often brought into life when our knowledge or our courage failed. In terms of knowledge, God was often brought in when we didn't know something, when we looked at the world and we were confronted with something that defied our understanding. And so we would bring God in as an explanation. And in terms of courage, Bonhoeffer says that what we would do is when we're faced with guilt, with death, with the difficulties of life, we would wheel God in as a comfort. And Bonhoeffer understands why we would do that, but he says that ultimately this notion of God has to die. And that if we're trying to give people this notion of God, we're actually trying to make them weak again, right? There are people now who are strong enough to realize we don't know everything and don't need to bring in an explanation to fill a gap, who are comfortable saying that yes, there'll always be stuff that we don't know, that we can continue to look into the world, we continue to do research in the sciences and in philosophy, and we don't need to somehow have some totalizing explanation. And there are people who are not afraid of death, that are not afraid of suffering, that are able to bear that burden of existence. And Bonhoeffer, far from wanting to make those people back into children, wants to be able to affirm that and think that that is strength and good. He says actually that the Deus ex machina is pointless, ignoble, and unchristian. He says it's pointless because a lot of people have moved beyond it. It doesn't make sense to people anymore. There's, of course, he says, some people for whom it does make sense. But for the vast majority of people, or at least where society is going, that type of God just doesn't really resonate. Secondly, he says it's ignoble, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to appeal to the weakest part of people. You're trying to make people selfish, think about themselves, think about their own suffering, and then God comes in as an answer, rather than meeting them in their strength and in their affirmation of life. And then finally, he says it's unchristian because you're confusing one stage of belief in God with every possible stage. saying that there's only one way to define that word within Christianity, when Bonhoeffer is saying, no, that guise, that understanding, that definition can die and another one arise. So what is Bonhoeffer's view on this new God that arises after the death of God? Bonhoeffer calls this religionless Christianity. It is a type of Christianity in which we fully give ourselves to the world. And in giving ourselves to the world and to one another, we find a deeper affirmation of life. We find a new understanding of the sacred arising. The sacred is not an object that we love, but rather the depth dimension that we experience in the act of love itself. Interestingly, we can turn to the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, because he had a really interesting definition of theism and atheism. Now, when you hear this definition, you've got to realize that he's defining this within a particular Jewish context. So this is a definition that's very different from what we hear in our daily lives. Levinas reflects deeply on the Torah and says that theism is a type of sensitivity to the neighbor. He says that every face we see has one statement written on it. It is always saying, do not murder me. Do not objectify, do not destroy. Do not defy. And theism is a sensitivity to that call in the face of the other. And atheism is a closing down to that call in the other. So for Levinas, there is this weak call in the world that is asking us to treat one another with respect, with dignity, and with love. And theism is nothing to do with the belief in gods or a god, but rather an ability to sensitize ourselves to that call. While atheism is a way of creating a protective barrier around us so that we do not let that call impact our lives and destabilize and decenter us. Now, this connects a little bit with Bonhoeffer, because Bonhoeffer is saying that if you embrace atheism, as in a full embrace of the earth without transcendence, without the need of a God of the gaps who fills in the absence in our knowledge, or a God who we can go to when we lack courage, we get rid of that and we embrace life. He says we enter into a type of theism. And the type of theism we discover is similar to that theism that Emmanuel Levinas is talking about when we open ourselves up to the sensitivity of that call. So everything I've been doing in these 3 sessions has been exploring a type of dialectic faith, a faith that stands between 2 extremes and brings them together. A faith that can live between knowing and unknowing, between satisfaction and dissatisfaction, and between theism and atheism. And one that brings all of these together in a faith that is about resolute commitment to the earth and to one another, but a resoluteness that also has humility. One in which we must act in fear and trembling, responding to that cry in the other that says, do not murder me. Responding resolutely, and yet with humility, knowing that our response might be wrong.